And we will today talk about, of course, the Parasha Chayei Sarah, which means Sarah's life, which in the beginning of the text is translated as "and Sarah lived," which is all. We don't translate words, we translate meanings. So, in our Parasha readings so far, we have seen the failure of personal, moral, and collective responsibility to mankind. That's what we've been talking about last week. We have learned also about a man, Abraham, who will change all that, not by political action, nor by war, but by a life lived in the presence of Adonai. After last week's emphasis on Abraham in a typical 21st century political correctness fashion, the parasha this week takes us to his wife, Sarah. It has been said that whereas a man may be the head of the woman, and I'm just quoting Paul here, if you don't like it, ask him. The woman is often the head that turns it, and they do make our heads turn. Another saying is that a woman can make or break a man. It could also be said that Sarah's devotion to her husband is what made him. She never tried to turn his head away from following his God. The name of this parasha is Chayei Sarah, meaning the life of Sarah, but oddly enough, it starts with the words, "and Sarah died." It is therefore a memorial of sorts for the mother of our faith. Here's Genesis 23, 1 and 2. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron in Israel, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. It's just good to remember that Abraham had to go to her because at the time he was not living with her. We're not told why, but after the offering of Mount Moriah, he never went back home. I wouldn't either. It was quite something. I don't imagine the conversation that would have taken place between them. But here's what the Talmud teaches about Sarah. It says, all the time that Sarah was alive, a lamp would be alight continuously from Shabbat Eve to Shabbat Eve in her tent. And a blessing would be found in the dough. Moreover, a cloud would be stationed over the tent. Because once she died, these happenings stopped. Cloud over her tent. So basically, from this description of the sages of Israel, we can see that Sarah was an earlier representation of the temple. The temple with its ever-burning menorah, the showbread that didn't grow stale from week to week, and the cloud of the Shekhinah which came at its dedication. Sarah is also behind King Solomon's anthology of the woman of valor in Proverbs 31. In the text this week, we are told that Sarah dies, and that therefore Abraham needs to buy this land to bury her. It says, Genesis 23, 3 and 4. Then he got up from his dead one and said to the sons of Heth, that's the Hittites. The Hittites lived in the land and on the land at that time. I'm a foreigner living as an alien with you. Let me have a burial site with you so that I can bury my dead wife. It's good to remember here that technically the land already belonged to him by divine decree. But things on earth usually take time to happen, even when they are already decreed in heaven. 4,000 years after the Abrahamic promise were given, Israel still has to fight today to justify its basic ownership of that land. The book of Hebrews makes mention of that time in Abraham's life when he talked about himself as an alien and stranger in the land of promise. It says in Hebrews 11:8 through 10, but by trusting, Abraham obeyed after being called to go out to a place which God would give him as possession. Indeed, he went out without knowing where he was going. By trusting, he lived as a temporary resident. Other words say alien, basically not a citizen. As a temporary resident in the land of promise, as if it were not his. Staying in tents with Yitzchak and Yaakov, who were to receive what was promised along with him. When Abraham tried to purchase a piece of land from the Hittites who lived in Canaan and owned that land at that time, the sons of Seth in Genesis 23:5 and 6 say to him, listen to us, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us, so choose any of our tombs to bury your dead. Choose any of our tombs to bury your dead. Now, one of us would refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. And he's talking about the tomb was a big cave or building where they put the body, and after a year they usually come and take the bones and put it in what's called an ossuary. That's where Yeshua, when he went into a tomb, they put it there. But 3 days later, there was no Yeshua, no bones, nothing. So, but just as Abraham did with the king of Sodom, when the king of Sodom wanted to offer a gift to Abraham for saving his people, Abraham refused the free gift and is intent on purchasing that piece of land. He doesn't want the free gift. Abraham knows that gifts sometimes come with strings attached. And the text tells us in Genesis 23:7 through 13. Abraham got up, bowed before the people of the land, the sons of Heth, and spoke with them. If it is your desire to help me bury my dead, then listen to me. Ask Ephron, the son of Zohar, to give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns, the one at the end of his field. He should sell it to me in your presence at its full value. Then I will have a burial site of my own. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among the sons of Heth, and he gave Abraham his answer in the presence of the sons of Heth, who belonged to the ruling council of the city. No, my Lord, listen to me. I'm giving you the field with its cave. I'm giving it to you. In the presence of my people, I will give it to you. Abraham bowed before the people of the land and spoke to Ephron in their hearing. Please, be good enough to listen to me. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me, and I will bury my dead there. Abraham did not want to have strings attached to the land of promise through an insincere gifting. Did Abraham see into our days? Until today, there are 3 places that are hotly contested in Israel, but that the Bible records as land purchases by the Jewish nation. Shechem in Samaria, purchased by Jacob. Mount Moriah purchased by King David, and the area surrounding the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, purchased by Abraham when he tried to marry Sarah, and where till today all the patriarchs and matriarchs, except Rachel, are buried. The Bible itself stands as the bona fide purchasers of these lands by the Jewish people. To believe in the Bible is to believe in these legal purchases. But these are today the most contested area by Israel and Arabia. It's almost like Abraham foreknew that it was going to be a problem, so he did not want to have an insincere gift to deal with. He wanted to have everything legit. Today, there are even sincere imams, Muslim priests, who do recognize the legitimacy of Israel's ownership of those lands. They do so because these texts are part of the Quran, which is actually narrative of Old New Testament plus the words of Muhammad. Ephraim the Hittite suggested to Abraham that an exorbitant price, a price that Abraham did not try to bargain over. He didn't say, "What? You're kidding?" Genesis 23:14-16. But Ephron answered Abraham, "My Lord, listen to me. A plot of land worth 400 silver shekels. What is that between me and you? Just bury your dead." So if you want to know what it was, maybe you can go, Rabbi Google will tell you what the equivalent in dollars, in American dollars. Abraham got to the point of what Ephron had said, so he weighed out for Ephron the amount of money he had specified in the presence of him. He did not bargain. He didn't say, "Oh, come on, 300. 400 silver shekels of the weight accepted among merchants. That's 10 pounds of silver. 10 pounds of silver. Abraham was willing to pay this exorbitant price because of his devotion to the covenant Hashem made with him. Who knows that he was not trying to buy the land little by little? Well, I don't know. But because of the covenant, he was going to pay any price. The land was more important than the silver. There is a lesson for us to be learned there in our service style, in our devotion to the covenant. When we serve God, which is really any time we serve people, we should give the most, the highest, the best, the 4-H prize lamb, your stud. Because our service to God is not about perfection or beauty. It's about substance. And giving or serving doesn't count until it starts hurting. King David knew that when he bought the piece of land of Jerusalem where the temple was eventually going to be built. And he said in 2 Samuel 24:24, the man who was going to give him the land, he said, "No, I will not give unto God of that which has cost me nothing." This is really important. We shouldn't give unto God of that which cost us nothing. We'll remember the story of Yeshua about the poor lady who gave a penny to the temple. Her gift was more important than those who gave 400 shekels because she gave of her substance, not her superfluous. Paul touches on the principle of injustice in one of his writings to the Corinthians, and how followers of Messiah should deal with injustice. He chides the Corinthians for bringing each other to court in front of Greek unbelievers. In 1 Corinthians 6, 1 through 7, and I will skip a little bit in between, he says, "How then one of you with a complaint against another go to court before pagan judges and not before God's people?" Verse 4, "If you require judgments about matters of everyday life, why do you put them in front of men who have no standing in the Messianic community? I say, shame on you." And then he says, if you are bringing lawsuits against each other, it's already a defeat for you. We call that a defeat of the Messianic community. And then he says, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? It was a better testimony to accept being wrong and be cheated, rather than show the whole world some of these things. And because to be wrong is to be cheated. Who's hurt? Our pride, our pocketbook. If justice is to be meted, it's God. It's God's commandment. The people who cheat us, who commit injustice towards us, it's God who disobeys, not us. And God can take care of his reputation. So, the answer to Paul's question, why not rather be wrong, why not rather be cheated, is probably personal pride, ego, and hubris. But back to Sarah. Sarah, who endorsed Abraham's different and revolutionary ideas of one God, who did not want any earthly representations of himself and did not revel in human sacrifices. The sages declare that a home without a woman is like a furnace without a fire. It lacks joy, warmth, and general happiness. And now, Sarah dies. As a result, Abraham needs to find, it doesn't say a new wife for himself, which he did later on, but his first reaction was to find a mother for Isaac, who was already an adult, nearing 40. A mother. But hey, even us adults need moms, especially us guys. So Abraham sent Eliezer to his family in the Babylon area to fetch a wife for Isaac. This deal that Abraham made with Eliezer was made on the strength of the covenant that Abraham signed with God. That's why Abraham asked, he says in Genesis 24:2, Abraham said to his servant who had served him the longest, who was in charge of all he owned, "Put your hand under my thigh. Because I want," then he says, the next verse says, "because I want you to swear by Adonai. Put your hand under my thigh." Today, people swear by putting their hand on the Bible. That is because the Bible has the text that defines the penalty for forswearing. We are bound to this text by covenant legalities with Hashem. This text was the text of God's covenant with mankind was not yet written on parchment or paper. There was no written account of it. The only sign of God's covenant with mankind through Abraham was in Abraham's circumcision. That is why Abraham asked Eliezer to put his hand under his thigh, because it had the same effect to put your hand on the Bible. By God, by God's covenant. We find this explanation in the following Midrashic text, which says, "Since one who swears must take with his hand an article related to a mitzvah, such as a Torah scroll or a tefillin. People would take the praying boxes to swear, or Torah scroll, like the Bible. And circumcision was the first mitzvah, so therefore, by putting his hand under Aaron's thigh, he was swearing by Adonai. The promise Eliezer had to make was as follows. God of heaven, you swear that by the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not choose a wife for my son among the women of the Canaanite, among whom I am living, but that you will go to my homeland, to my kinsmen, to choose a wife for my son Yitzchak. The servant replied, suppose the woman is willing to follow me to this land. Must I then bring your son back to the land from which he came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you don't bring my son back there. Adonai, the God of heaven, who took me away from my father's house and away from the land I was born in, who spoke to me and swore to me, I will give this land to your descendant. He will send his angel ahead of you, and you are to bring a wife for my son from there. The whole project was covenant related, because the choice of a wife for Isaac was essential for the continuation of the covenant. Isaac was to continue in the road his father started. That is why she was forbidden to marry. He was forbidden to marry a Canaanite. There was no going back on what God had started with Abraham. In his deal with Eliezer, Abraham was making sure his son followed in his footsteps. From this, we learn the importance of passing on our faith and belief to our children. And this can only be done through the way we live. Our faith and belief are not passed on through just words and knowledge. It's done through a life lived in the presence of God. So, Eliezer, who was an adopted servant in the house of Abraham, was charged with the continuation of the covenant. And look at something here. Eliezer had something to lose. Abraham was a rich sheik. He was like a prince of the desert. Rich. If Abraham had no son, Eliezer became next in line. According to the law of Torah, he was the law of the land, and was next. Eliezer was the next guy. And Abraham sends the guy who's got everything to lose in the bargain to find a wife. What a relationship they had. What a trust he had in Eliezer. What faithfulness did Eliezer have in everything towards Abraham. This was a heavy responsibility. So Eliezer asked God for a confirmation sign. The sign Eliezer asked was very smart. If Isaac's wife were to become the next matriarch, she had to fill in Sarah's shoes. A tough act to follow. Abraham and Sarah's houses were known for their hospitality. Sarah was known to honor her husband. So Eliezer tested Rebekah's ability to be Isaac's wife by testing her ability to serve, even at great length. He tested her unquestioning ability to serve a stranger with a high demand service without any incentive or reward. This happened when Eliezer asked for water for himself. Not only did she quench Eliezer's thirst, but offered it for 10 camels, each being able to drink 10 to 15 gallons. This was the test of her worthiness to walk in Sarah's shoes. There is a great lesson here. I want to quote something, but I don't know where from. This is where my favorite editor, Audrey, when she looks at my writing, she says, I write something and I don't write an author. She says, reference! And then I go, oh, quit it. But here's that quote. It says, Hashem chose in the light, which means knowledge, those who chose him while they were in darkness, which means ignorance. That is why night comes before day, when ignorance, before we knowledge. And while we experience this world, before we experience the world to come. So he chose in the light, chose in the light those who chose him while they were in darkness. Rebecca was in an idolatrous household. There were idolatrous there. Her father, that's where actually even Abraham's father was an idol maker, was an idol merchant. So here, she was this idol person. She worshipped idol, but she was not idol. Because she had this heart to serve, and she did not even know God. Actually, the same thing happened to Abraham, Rebecca, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. He tests our hearts. So basically, Rebecca represents a distant foreign relative who was to come out of Babylon, and we talked about that last week, to be part of the household of Abraham. She did not know the God of Abraham. She came from an idolatrous household, yet she had good principles, godly principles. Serving is a thing of godliness. Hospitality is one of the signs of the Spirit of God. And serving. She was chosen because of her godliness, even while in ignorance of God. It's a little bit like Paul talked about in Romans. In Romans 1:19 through 20, he says, he talks about unbelievers, people who don't know God, idol worshippers. He says, because of what is known, people who say, how am I supposed to know God if nobody has ever taught it to me? Giving themselves an excuse. He said of these people, because what is known about God is plain to them, since God made it plain to them. He's talking about unbelievers, idolaters from Rome. He says, what is known about God is plain to them, since God has made it plain to them. Oh, okay. For ever since the creation of the universe, his invisible qualities, both his eternal power and his divine nature, has been clearly seen from the beginning of the creation of the universe. His invisible qualities are clearly seen. That doesn't work together very well. His invisible qualities and his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen because they can be understood from what he has made. Therefore, they have no excuse. So basically, if we don't know God, all we have to do is look at creation. And he tells us about God. There's plenty of little details about creation. You know, and that's how actually in the stories in Jewish books, that's how Abraham discovered God. He looked at the stars. He started seeing he said, wait a minute. There's a plan here. It's not like random. The same patterns come at the same type of dates, and you say, wait a minute. Whenever there is a plan, that means there is a planner. And it cannot be that little piece of wood my father made this morning in the back of the shop. So he says again, for ever since the creation of the universe, his invisible qualities, both his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen because they can be understood from what he has made. Therefore, they have no excuse.
What's the reference?
Romans 1:19 and 20. Genesis 24:67 says, Then Yitzchak brought her into his mother's Sarah's tent and took Rebecca, and she became his wife and loved her. Thus was Yitzchak comforted for the loss of his mother. Isaac is not going to Babylon. It was forbidden. Abraham forbade it. It's Rebecca, who comes out of Babylon and becomes Sarah. He says he brought her into Sarah's tent. So, I mean, think of it today, you know. What if somebody wants to marry you, you go to marry, and all he wants is you to be his mother, and you're the comfort because he lost his mother. You know, this is what the text tells us here. And Rivka didn't make a fuss about it. And here's what a famous Jewish sage from Middle Age called Rashi, this time I know who it is who said it. He said, look at what he says about it. It says, and he, Isaac, brought her, Rebecca, into the tent, and behold, she was Sarah, his mother. This is to say that she became the image of Sarah, his mother. For all the time that Sarah was alive, her lamp would be alight continuously from Shabbat Eve to Shabbat Eve. A blessing would be found in her dough. Moreover, a cloud would be stationed over the tent. But once she died, this happening stopped. And when Rebecca came, they returned. They returned. So there is really, there's really very large implications about that. It's quite Rebecca becomes Sarah. She goes into Sarah's tent. She doesn't make a fuss about it. Now, we've all heard the Midrash about Isaac. About Isaac being like an image of Messiah. Isaac who carried his own sacrificial wood on the very mountain where Yeshua carried his. This Messianic application of Isaac is not just a Christian Messianic view. It's actually part of Jewish teaching about Messiah. Isaac is a symbol of the Messiah which is to come. It's actually, if you look at a prayer book for the Rosh Hashanah prayers, it's all about Isaac and the sacrifices, Abraham, Isaac, and all. It's all about that because Rosh Hashanah is about the coronation of the king and about the coronation of King Messiah, and Isaac is a representation of King Messiah. So, if Isaac is a representation of Messiah, who is Rebecca? Rebecca is the representation of Messiah's bride, who comes out of Babylon, like we talked about last week, to marry Isaac into the family of Abraham, and to enter Sarah's tent. She doesn't make a fuss about this. Why do you have to use your mom's tent? Why can't you get a tent for me? Why do you have to be with your mom's stuff? You know, I want my own stuff. Come on, you can't afford it. That was not the point. It was not a question of of not being able to afford a tent for Rebecca. It was a question of walking in Sarah's shoes, becoming Sarah, the matriarch, of taking on the anointing of Sarah, the place of Sarah. Rebecca was not to create a new household with new ideas, new furniture. So Rebecca doesn't make a fuss about entering Sarah's tent. She's not asking questions about it. She doesn't make a fuss about becoming Sarah's image. She takes it as an honor and a privilege. As the bride of Messiah, the body of believers is also to enter Sarah's tent, the wife of Abraham, and live by the precepts of Sarah as taught by Abraham. Yeshua says it actually in different words. He says, if we are children of Abraham, we should do the deeds of Abraham. As Abraham and Sarah's tent were, our tent needs to always be open to guests, to foreigners, unbelievers, and Yeshua even said enemies. The light of Hashem, representing the knowledge and application of His word, is to burn continually in our tent. And our bread, or spiritual food, needs to never be stale. The spirit of the Shekinah also needs to abide in us at all times, in times of joy, as in times of sadness, in times of wealth, as in times of poverty, in times of health, as in times of sickness, in times of life, as in times of death. Abba Father, we thank you for all the words that has been left to us about Sarah. Help us as a body of believers in this generation, in this age, in this country, in this time, to be a representation of Sarah from the household of Abraham. Help our tent to be open. Help your light to shine in us, like you say, we are the light of the world. And help our bread to not grow stale. Help us to be who you want us to be and unashamedly enter Sarah's tent in the household of Abraham. B'Shem Yeshua Mashiach. Amen.